Late one night in Miami, two police officers pulled over a woman, confident they had just made an easy arrest. What they didn't know? She was a highly trained CIO agent, one who had the power to bring their entire operation crashing down. How will she turn the tables and expose the corruption they thought was untouchable? Stay tuned to find out, and don't forget to subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The Miami streets were quiet, bathed in the glow of flickering streetlights. It was well past midnight, and the coastal humidity clung to the air. Danielle Harris gripped the steering wheel of her black sedan, maneuvering through the empty residential roads. She had just wrapped up an undercover mission, and the night should have ended uneventfully. As she reached a deserted intersection, she slowed down, her trained eyes instinctively scanning her surroundings. Years of CIA fieldwork had taught her to trust her instincts. The moment she made a full stop at the intersection and turned left, her rearview mirror flashed red and blue lights. A cop car. Danielle took a slow breath, suppressing the irritation that crept up her spine. She wasn't worried. She had protocols for situations like this, but something felt off. Miami police didn't usually patrol this area at this hour. She pulled over, cutting the engine. The flashing lights remained on as two officers stepped out of the squad car. One was tall, with a rigid, authoritative walk, Officer Greg Lawson. The other, shorter but stockier, followed closely behind, Officer Kevin Brooks. Danielle kept her face neutral as Lawson approached her window, flashlight in hand. The beam swept across her face, then into the car interior. "Evening, ma'am," Lawson said, his voice carrying forced politeness. "You know why I pulled you over?" Danielle met his gaze calmly. "No, officer. I wasn't speeding, and I came to a full stop at the intersection." Lawson smirked, the kind of grin that made her stomach turn. "Actually, you rolled right through that stop sign." Danielle's brows furrowed ever so slightly. Lying. She had stopped completely and she knew it, but she knew better than to argue. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding," she said smoothly. "License and registration." Danielle moved carefully, retrieving her documents from the glove compartment. The officers watched her closely, as if expecting her to do something suspicious. She handed them over, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Lawson scanned her license, while Brooks casually walked toward the back of her vehicle. "You live around here?" Lawson asked, his voice too casual. "Yes," Danielle answered, keeping her tone even. Behind her, she heard Brooks call out, "Hey, Lawson, you might want to take a look at this." Danielle's jaw tightened. She glanced into her side mirror, watching Brooks point at something in her trunk. Lawson returned her license, his demeanor shifting. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Danielle didn't move. "May I ask why?" "We have reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances." Danielle's heart rate didn't change, but her mind sharpened instantly. A setup. She slowly opened the door and stepped out, standing tall despite the tension crackling in the air. Brooks was already at the open trunk, smirking as he gestured toward a small, unmarked bag sitting near the edge. "Well, look at that," he said, shaking his head in mock surprise. "Bag of powder. Wonder what we got here." Danielle glanced at the mysteriously placed bag, then back at them, so her expression unreadable. That bag had not been there when she left home. Lawson crossed his arms. "Anything you want to tell us, Miss Harris?" Danielle tilted her head slightly, her eyes calculating. Then she let out a small, almost amused breath. "I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting." Lawson chuckled. "Oh, you'll have your chance, all right." Brooks grabbed her wrist, snapping the handcuffs on tight. Danielle didn't resist. She allowed them to think they had won, but she knew better. They had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. Danielle Harris sat in the back of the police cruiser, hands cuffed behind her back, her expression unreadable. The squad car hummed as it moved through the dimly lit Miami streets. The occasional flicker of neon lights from closed gas stations and 24-hour diners passed across her face, but she remained still, her mind working at lightning speed. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong. It was a setup, deliberate, rehearsed, and methodical. The bag of drugs hadn't been in her trunk when she left her apartment, she was certain, and now, these officers were taking her to the station, fully believing they had just pulled off the perfect arrest. Officer Greg Lawson, the senior of the two, glanced at her through the rearview mirror, smirking. "You're awfully quiet back there," he said, his tone smug. "Most people would be begging by now. You got nothing to say." Danielle met his gaze through the mirror, her expression calm. "Should I be worried?" Lawson chuckled, shaking his head. "You're either real brave or real stupid. I've seen tough ones before. Doesn't take long for them to crack." She didn't respond. There was nothing to say to men like him, men who thought power gave them control. Next to Lawson, Officer Kevin Brooks turned slightly in his seat, glancing back at her. "Funny you don't look like a dealer," he said, pretending to be thoughtful. "But, hey, people surprise me all the time." Danielle smiled slightly. "Likewise." Brooks frowned at her composure, but before he could say anything else, Lawson pulled into the Miami police station. The building was a mix of modern and outdated, glass doors leading into a dimly lit lobby, flickering fluorescent lights inside. As soon as they parked, Brooks stepped out first, opening the back door. "All right, let's go," he said, gripping her arm a little harder than necessary as he pulled her out of the car. Danielle allowed them to think they were in control. Inside, the station was relatively quiet. The graveyard shift officers were scattered around, some sipping bad coffee, others flipping through paperwork. A few glanced at Danielle as Lawson and Brooks led her to the booking desk. One of them, Officer Jake Martinez, the rookie, watched with a furrowed brow. He had seen arrests before, but something about this one didn't sit right. Lawson handed the evidence bag to the desk sergeant. "Caught her with this," he said casually. "Trafficking charge." The sergeant raised an eyebrow, glancing at Danielle. "She doesn't look like the usual type." Danielle remained silent as Brooks forced her to sit on a metal bench against the wall. Martinez, still watching, took a step closer. "What was the probable cause?" he asked hesitantly. Lawson turned, fixing him with a condescending smirk. "She ran a stop sign," he said smoothly. "Looked nervous. We had enough reason to search." Martinez frowned. "And she consented to the search?" Brooks let out a scoff. "Kid, when you do this job long enough, you stop worrying about the little details. She had drugs in her trunk. That's all that matters." Danielle, still sitting on the bench, finally spoke. "What a fascinating interpretation of the law." Brooks shot her a glare. "No one asked you." She leaned back against the cold wall, observing Martinez. He wasn't fully convinced. That was an opening. The officers continued processing paperwork, while Martinez walked over to his computer. Something gnawed at him. He pulled up Danielle's arrest record, or at least what little there was. No priors, no reports, just a clean, nearly blank file. His gut told him something was off. Meanwhile, Danielle subtly shifted her wrist, pressing against a tiny hidden device embedded in her sleeve. A silent signal was sent. Somewhere in Miami, her CIA team received it. The officers had no idea what they had just triggered. The station buzzed with quiet activity, Low murmurs between officers, the distant sound of a ringing phone, and the occasional rustle of paperwork. Danielle Harris remained seated on the cold metal bench, her hands resting on her lap, her body language unthreatening. She knew the importance of patience. She had been trained for situations like this. Across the room, Officer Jake Martinez sat at his desk, eyes flickering between his computer screen and the booking area where Danielle was being processed. Something wasn't adding up. He couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at him. No criminal record, no priors, a clean background. And yet, she was being booked for trafficking? He glanced toward Officer Greg Lawson and Officer Kevin Brooks, who stood near the break room, laughing over their coffee. Their body language was too relaxed, their amusement too forced, as if they had done this before. Martinez's fingers hovered over his keyboard. A quick search through department records wouldn't hurt, right? He typed in Lawson and Brooks' names, filtering their past arrests. A pattern emerged, nearly identical reports of minor traffic stops, escalating into major drug charges. Almost all the suspects? People of color. His stomach twisted. Meanwhile, across the room, Danielle watched him closely, recognizing the small signs of hesitation, the way his eyes darted back and forth between her and his screen. He was starting to question things. Good. Lawson finally strolled over, tossing a stack of paperwork onto Martinez's desk. Got something to say, rookie? Martinez hesitated before responding. Just noticing? A lot of your stops end the same way. Lawson tilted his head, a slow smirk forming. Yeah? And? Martinez kept his tone neutral. It's just interesting. All these cases, same charges, same circumstances. Brooks leaned in, shaking his head. You're new here, kid. Let me give you some advice. Don't go looking for problems that aren't there. Martinez swallowed, nodding slowly, but the doubt in his eyes remained. Danielle decided it was time to push a little further. She cleared her throat, making both officers turn toward her. I'd love to see the official report on this arrest. Lawson laughed. You'll get your copy in court. Danielle tilted her head, her voice calm but firm. Funny, because I'm pretty sure your report isn't going to match the security footage from my street. Silence. A flicker of something, uncertainty, crossed Brooks' face. Lawson, however, recovered quickly. We're done here, he said, waving off her words as he turned back to Martinez. Just process the damn paperwork. Martinez hesitated, then nodded. But as soon as Lawson walked away, he did something he wasn't supposed to do. He opened the surveillance system. Meanwhile, miles away, inside an unmarked government facility, a team of intelligence officers sat before multiple screens, tracking the silent distress beacon that had come from Danielle's hidden device. Agent Marcus Reed, Danielle's handler, stood at the center, arms crossed. Sheethy sent the signal 15 minutes ago. One of the tech specialists reported. She's at a local precinct. No further activity. Reed's jaw tightened. She's playing the long game. A younger agent leaned forward. We could pull her out now? No, Reed interrupted. Not yet. If she hasn't called for an extraction, she wants us to wait. He studied the map of Miami, pinpointing the exact location of the station. Then, he made his decision. Monitor all comms coming in and out of that precinct. If anything escalates, we move. Until then, we let her do what she does best. Back in the station, Martinez found the security footage from the area where Danielle had been stopped. He hit play. The video showed Danielle coming to a complete stop at the intersection. No traffic violation. Martinez's heart pounded. His fingers trembled over the keyboard. This was proof. He turned slightly, glancing toward Danielle. She was watching him. A silent understanding passed between them. He had a choice, and she was waiting to see what he would do. The Miami courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, cameras flashing as people murmured in anticipation. This case had made headlines overnight, a routine traffic stop that unraveled into something much bigger. At the front of the courtroom, Danielle Harris sat beside her attorney, her posture straight, her face unreadable. Across the room, officers Greg Lawson and Kevin Brooks looked visibly tense. Gone was their smug confidence from the night of the arrest. They were no longer in control. The prosecution table was stacked with documents, surveillance footage, and police records, all waiting to be used against them. The trial had barely begun, and the walls were already closing in. The prosecutor, Sarah Caldwell, stood, holding a remote. "Your Honor, let's begin with the traffic violation that led to Ms. Harris's arrest." The courtroom lights dimmed as a large screen lit up. A street camera feed played. Danielle's car, approaching the stop sign, and coming to a full, complete stop. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Caldwell turned to the jury. "That doesn't look like a moving violation, does it?" She paused before continuing, clicking the remote again. "Now, let's watch what happens 10 minutes later, when Officers Lawson and Brooks search Ms. Harris's vehicle." The screen switched to the police station's own security feed, one that had been quietly pulled from the precinct's archives after Officer Jake Martinez decided to act. The footage showed Lawson and Brooks in the parking lot, before the search even began, holding an unmarked bag. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Lawson's face paled. Brooks shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Caldwell turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the evidence was planted. The officers were in possession of the bag before they even conducted the search." Judge Reynolds leaned forward, his expression tight. "I want an explanation for this, right now." Lawson's attorney jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is being taken out of context." But before he could continue, another voice cut through the courtroom. "I'd like to testify." All heads turned to Officer Jake Martinez, who had just stood up from the back of the courtroom. Lawson stiffened. Brooks muttered something under his breath. Martinez walked forward, his expression uneasy but determined. Judge Reynolds studied him for a moment. "Officer Martinez, are you prepared to make a sworn statement?" Martinez nodded firmly. "Yes, Your Honor. I have something the court needs to hear." Once Martinez took the stand, everything changed. Under Caldwell's questioning, he revealed the truth about the department's history of planted evidence, about how Lawson and Brooks had framed multiple suspects using identical methods. "I looked into past arrests," Martinez said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "There were at least 17 cases where Lawson and Brooks conducted random searches during traffic stops. And each time, conveniently, drugs were found." He glanced toward the defense table, where the two officers sat, stone-faced, their jaws clenched. Martinez exhaled sharply. "At first, I thought maybe it was just luck. But after what happened to Ms. Harris, I couldn't ignore it anymore." Caldwell stepped forward. "And what did you do when you realized something was wrong?" I went against protocol." Martinez swallowed, but he kept going. "I accessed internal surveillance, and I saw them. I saw them plant the evidence before the search." He turned toward Danielle. Their eyes met, a silent moment of acknowledgement. "This wasn't an accident," Martinez finished. "It was deliberate. They knew exactly what they were doing." Caldwell turned toward Danielle, the defendant who had sat silently through most of the proceedings. "Ms. Harris," she said, "would you please tell the court about your actual occupation?" Danielle stood up smoothly, her gaze locking onto Lawson and Brooks as she spoke 4 words that changed everything. "I work for the CIA." Gasps exploded through the courtroom. Lawson and Brooks froze. Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom." Danielle continued, "I was in Miami under an active federal assignment. My arrest jeopardized an ongoing investigation." She turned toward the judge. "I don't think these officers realized who they were dealing with." At that moment, 2 federal agents stood from the prosecution's side of the courtroom. One of them, Agent Marcus Reed, spoke. "Your Honor, as part of an ongoing investigation, we have been tracking corruption within the Miami Police Department. We can confirm that Ms. Harris's arrest was an intentional act of misconduct." The judge turned to Lawson and Brooks. "Do either of you have anything to say for yourselves?" Silence. Lawson's lawyer whispered frantically to him, but the senior officer just stared blankly ahead. Finally, Brooks muttered, "We want a deal." Too late. Judge Reynolds straightened in his seat. "Given the overwhelming evidence, I have no choice but to dismiss all charges against Ms. Harris and order an immediate investigation into Officers Lawson and Brooks' conduct." He banged the gavel. Case dismissed. Lawson and Brooks were arrested on the spot, led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. The reporters outside swarmed the doors, shouting questions. The Miami PD was thrown into chaos, with multiple cases now under review. As for Danielle, she stepped outside the courthouse without a single charge to her name. Agent Reed was waiting for her by the curb. "Told you they wouldn't know what hit them," he said with a smirk. Danielle exhaled, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Took them long enough." Reed nodded toward the waiting car. "We should debrief. But first, do you want to say anything to Martinez?" Danielle glanced back toward the courtroom steps, where Martinez stood watching. She met his gaze, giving him a slight nod. He nodded back. No words were needed. He had made his choice, and it had changed everything. The sun hung low over Miami as Danielle Harris walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the last few days finally beginning to lift. Justice had been served. Behind her, the once smug officers Greg Lawson and Kevin Brooks were being escorted into a squad car, this time in handcuffs. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same officers who had framed her were now being driven to the very jail cells they once controlled. Agent Marcus Reed leaned against an unmarked black SUV, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. "Told you it'd work out," he said. Danielle smirked. "It always does. Eventually." Reed nodded toward the courthouse steps, where Officer Jake Martinez stood, watching them. The young officer had risked everything to tell the truth, and now his life within the force would never be the same. "You should talk to him," Reed said. Danielle considered it, then walked over. Martinez straightened as she approached, his expression uncertain. "You did the right thing," she said simply. Martinez exhaled, nodding. "Didn't feel like it at first." He glanced back toward the courthouse. "I don't know what happens next." Danielle studied him for a moment. Then, "Make it count." Martinez gave a small, resolute nod. As Danielle turned to leave, Reed opened the car door for her. "Where to next?" he asked. Danielle slid into the seat, glancing at the Miami skyline one last time. "There's always another fight," she said. The door shut. The SUV pulled away. And just like that, she was gone. This story isn't just about a wrongful arrest. It's about power, corruption, and the courage to stand against injustice. It reminds us that truth always finds a way to surface, but it requires people willing to stand up, even when it's difficult. One of the biggest takeaways is the importance of integrity. Officer Jake Martinez had a choice: look the other way or take a stand. His decision to expose the truth not only cleared an innocent person, but also helped dismantle a corrupt system. In our own lives, we often face moments where speaking up feels risky, but doing what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, can create real change. Another lesson is awareness. Danielle's calm under pressure saved her. She understood the system, anticipated risks, and used her intelligence to turn the situation in her favor. This teaches us to stay vigilant, question inconsistencies, and trust our instincts. Finally, this story highlights the responsibility of law enforcement. While most officers serve honorably, unchecked power can lead to abuse. Holding authority figures accountable isn't about attacking the system. It's about making it stronger. Injustice thrives in silence. The truth only prevails when people refuse to ignore it. If you were in Officer Jake Martinez's position, what would you do? Would you choose to stand up and expose the truth, even if it meant putting yourself at risk? 1. Or would you stay silent to protect your own safety? 2. Drop a comment with 1 or 2 below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe to support the channel, and stay tuned for more powerful stories.